In 1955, deep beneath the American desert, a virus was created to end a war without bullets. But when it escaped, it turned an entire secret laboratory into a graveyard of the living. And by the time the truth reached the surface, the only way to stop what was coming was to erase every soul underground with fire from the sky. Part 1. In 1955, at the height of the Cold War, America was fighting a silent war far from the public eye. And deep beneath the Nevada desert stood a classified underground facility known only to a handful of officials as Site R-12, a place erased from maps and sealed from the world. And scientists believed this organism could reanimate dead neural tissue while erasing higher brain function, effectively leaving the body alive, but the mind reduced to hunger and aggression. And early animal tests showed horrifying promise as subjects pronounced dead would suddenly reawaken minutes later with discolored eyes, violent reflexes, and an uncontrollable urge to bite and tear at living flesh, a sight that filled Dr. Weiss with pride and Dr. Eleanor with dread, as she secretly documented her fears in a personal journal, writing that they were not creating life, but imprisoning death inside a moving body. Security inside Site R-12 intensified as rumors spread among staff. Armed guards lined every corridor, airtight steel doors sealed each sector, and negative pressure chambers were installed to prevent airborne leaks. Yet fears seeped through the walls as the project escalated into human trials, using prisoners and missing persons officially declared deceased. Men and women injected with 55-7 under the false promise of experimental medical treatment, and the first human test subject collapsed within minutes, his heartbeat flatlining as doctors declared him dead, only for the corpse to convulse violently 11 minutes later, ripping through the body bag and attacking the nearest nurse with inhuman strength, tearing flesh from bone as blood sprayed across the laboratory walls, guards firing bullets that barely slowed the creature until its skull was completely destroyed, leaving behind a silence broken only by screams and alarms, a moment that haunted Eleanor and marked the point of no return. Because instead of shutting the project down, government agencies ordered expansion, insisting that Russia was closer than ever to deploying its own biological weapon, and fear outweighed morality, forcing the scientists to continue despite the growing number of failed subjects piling up in incineration chambers below the lab. At night, Eleanor and Weiss stood together behind reinforced glass, watching infected bodies restrained and twitching in containment cells, whispering about escape, about confessing, about stopping everything before it was too late. But every exit was monitored, every message censored, and every worker reminded that silence meant survival. While deep within the ventilation systems of Site R-12, something unseen was already beginning to spread, something no protocol could fully contain, as LV-7 quietly adapted, mutating faster than expected, learning how to move not just through blood, but through breath itself. And though no one realized it yet, the virus had already chosen its first real battlefield. Not a foreign nation, not an enemy city, but the very laboratory that created it, setting the stage for a nightmare that would consume every soul trapped inside and remain buried as one of America's darkest secrets, waiting to unfold. Part 2. The realization that LV-7 was mutating came too late, because by the time the senior staff gathered in the observation chamber to discuss the abnormal readings coming from the air filtration system, microscopic traces of the virus had already escaped the containment wing and begun circulating through Site R-12's ventilation shafts, invisible, odorless, and deadly, spreading with every breath taken by the scientists, guards, and technicians who still believed they were safe behind steel doors and military protocols. And the first sign that something was terribly wrong appeared when a night shift security officer named Raymond Holt collapsed near Elevator C after complaining of a sudden migraine and ringing in his ears. his fellow guards dragging him to the medical bay, where monitors showed his vital signs dropping rapidly, pulse slowing, skin temperature falling, and pupils dilating until the doctor quietly pronounced him dead. But before the sheet could be pulled over his face, Raymond's body jerked violently, restraints snapping as he let out a deep, animalistic growl and lunged forward with impossible strength, sinking his teeth into the medic's shoulder and ripping away flesh as screams echoed through the sterile hallway, blood smearing across white tiles, alarms blaring for the first time outside the test wing. And it was then that panic began to spread faster than any virus. Because this infection had not come from an injection or direct contact with test subjects, it had come from the air itself, something Eleanor immediately understood when she saw 3 more staff members collapse within minutes, all showing identical neurological shutdown patterns. Emergency lockdown procedures were initiated as blast doors slammed shut across multiple levels, trapping dozens of people inside sealed sectors, including Eleanor and Weiss, who were now confined to the main research floor with limited communication to command, while on the lower levels chaos erupted as infected guards tore through unarmed technicians, gunfire echoing uselessly through narrow corridors, as bullets slowed bodies, but failed to stop them, because LV-7 did not respond to pain or fear, only movement and sound, and every scream only attracted more of them. Elena watched through a reinforced glass panel as a young lab assistant. She had trained for months, was dragged to the ground by 2 infected men. Her pleas muffled as teeth and hands tore her apart. And something inside Eleanor broke completely, realizing this was no longer an experiment, but an extinction event contained within concrete walls, and she turned to Weiss, demanding they shut down the ventilation system entirely. But he hesitated, knowing that doing so would suffocate everyone trapped inside sealed wings, infected or not. And that moment of hesitation cost lives as the virus continued to circulate, infecting more people with every second. Radio transmissions from security checkpoints became increasingly fragmented, filled with screaming, gunshots, and incoherent warnings about the dead walking, until finally one message cut through the noise from level 4, where a married couple, Daniel and Margaret Cole, both data analysts assigned to Project Lazarus, reported that they were barricaded inside a records room after witnessing multiple attacks, their voices shaking but clear as they described co-workers, collapsing and reawakening moments later with blank eyes and violent intent. And though Eleanor had only met them briefly, their calm desperation stood out amid the chaos, especially when Daniel asked a question that froze the command room into silence. If this was supposed to be a weapon, why can't you control it? Military command responded by ordering total quarantine of Site R-12, cutting all external access and sealing surface elevators permanently, effectively condemning everyone inside to either die human or live as something else. And as oxygen systems began to recycle contaminated air, infection rates spiked exponentially, turning entire wings into slaughter zones where shadows moved unnaturally and metallic scraping echoed as infected bodies clawed at locked doors, their jaws snapping endlessly, teeth chattering against steel as blood pooled beneath them. Eleonora attempted to synthesize a counteragent using earlier versions of the virus, but time was against her. Reagents contaminated, equipment destroyed, and the lab itself becoming a maze of death. While Weiss grew increasingly silent, haunted by the realization that his ambition had unleashed something no nation could ever truly weaponize, something that did not obey borders or command structures, only hunger, and when emergency lighting failed on several floors, plunging corridors into darkness broken only by red warning strobes, survivors began reporting shapes moving in groups, not randomly, but with disturbing coordination, suggesting that LV-7 was not just reanimating bodies, but evolving behavior, adapting to its environment, learning. Eleanor and Weiss eventually made contact again with Daniel and Margaret Cole, guiding them through maintenance tunnels toward a supposedly secure zone, unaware that this couple's journey through blood-soaked corridors, crawling past mutilated bodies, and listening to the echo of inhuman moans, would soon become the most tragic thread in a disaster already beyond saving. Because as Site R-12 descended deeper into silence, one horrifying truth became undeniable to those still alive inside. The virus was no longer leaking. It had taken control, and the laboratory that created death had become its first kingdom. Part 3. The maintenance tunnels beneath Site R-12 were never meant for evacuation. Only 4 cables, pipes, and silent machines. And as Daniel and Margaret Cole crawled through the narrow steel passage guided by Eleanor's trembling voice over a crackling radio, the smell of rust, oil, and blood grew heavier with every meter. Because above them, the lab was dying one corridor at a time, and the sounds of it seeped through the walls, and the form of distant screams abruptly cut short, and the constant wet, dragging noise of infected bodies being pulled across floors, while Eleanor and Weiss moved through the upper levels, toward the central control hub, stepping over shattered glass and abandoned equipment, their boots occasionally crunching on something neither of them wanted to identify. And with every step, Eleanor felt the crushing weight of responsibility because the mutation she had warned about was now undeniable. LV7 was no longer behaving like a simple reanimation virus. It was accelerating neural pathways related to aggression and spatial awareness, while suppressing everything human, turning people into predators that hunted sound, movement, even fear itself. And when they reached a security office, they found evidence that chilled them both. CCTV monitors, still running, showed infected subjects no longer wandering aimlessly but surrounding locked rooms, waiting, pounding on doors, only when someone inside made noise. A level of coordination that should not have been possible. And Weiss finally whispered the truth he had been avoiding, that the virus had begun forming a primitive hive response, using the remnants of the human brain to communicate through patterns of movement and sound. Meaning, the longer this continued, the smarter the infected would become. Meanwhile, Daniel and Margaret reached a junction where the tunnels split, their flashlight beams shaking as they heard footsteps above. Slow at first, then drugging, then suddenly stopping directly over their heads. And Margaret clutched Daniel's arms so tightly, her nails drew blood as they held their breath, listening to fingernails scrape against metal as if something was searching for them through the floor. And though the creature eventually moved on, the realization settled into their bones that silence was the only thing keeping them alive. But silence was also isolating them from any chance of rescue. On level 3, a group of remaining guards attempted to escort civilian staff to a safe room near the reactor wing. But the plan collapsed when one of the injured guards, bitten earlier and hidden under layers of clothing, convulsed mid-march, his spine arching as his heartbeat stopped. And before anyone could react, he rose with a guttural snarl, attacking from within the group, turning the narrow hallway into a slaughterhouse where bullets ricocheted uselessly and bodies piled up so fast that survivors slipped in blood as they ran. And this internal collapse repeated itself across the facility as more people realized too late that even a single bite was a delayed death sentence. Eleanor reached the control hub and attempted to send a final detailed transmission to Washington describing the airborne mutation, the hive behavior, and the impossibility of containment. But the reply she received was short, cold, and devastating, ordering all on-site personnel to focus on data preservation rather than survival. A command that confirmed what she feared most, that everyone inside Site R-12 had already been written off, and she collapsed into a chair, tears streaking down her face, as Weiss stood frozen, staring at the monitors showing their colleagues being torn apart by things wearing human skin. Below them, Daniel and Margaret emerged from the tunnels into an auxiliary storage level, only to find the walls smeared with handprints and claw marks, bodies stacked against a locked door, as if they had been used as shields. And when Margaret accidentally knocked over a metal canister, the echo rang out like a gunshot, followed by an answering chorus of moans from multiple directions. And as shadows began to move at the edges of their light, Daniel realized with a sickening certainty that the infected were no longer just reacting. They were converging, closing in from different paths with deliberate intent, forcing the couple to run hand in hand through a maze of shelves and darkness, unaware that every step they took was drawing them deeper into the heart of a nightmare that had outgrown its creators. While far above them, sealed blast doors and red warning lights marked the slow, irreversible transition of Site R-12 from a secret laboratory into a living grave. Part 4. Daniel and Margaret ran until their lungs burned and their legs felt like lead, weaving through storage aisles as the sound behind them changed from scattered moans into a unified, relentless pursuit. Feet slapping against concrete in uneven rhythms, bodies colliding with shelves yet never slowing. And when Daniel finally slammed a heavy steel door shut behind them and twisted the manual lock, the impact of bodies crashing into it sent vibrations through the metal that rattled their bones, forcing them to collapse together in the dark, whispering each other's names just to prove they were still alive. While, somewhere above, Eleanor regained control of herself and began pulling archived footage and data from secure servers, copying everything onto analog reels and magnetic tapes, because digital transmission had become unreliable. Her hands shaking as she labeled files detailing LV-7's airborne mutation and behavioral evolution, knowing these records would likely never be seen, but unable to accept that the truth should die with them. And as she worked, Weiss moved through adjacent corridors, searching for survivors, his radio filled with nothing but static and distant screams, until he encountered a small group barricaded inside a chemical prep room, their faces hollow with terror. One of them clutching a bitten arm wrapped tightly in cloth, insisting he felt fine, that it was just a scratch. And Weiss saw in their eyes the same denial he himself had carried for months, the belief that science could still control what it had unleashed. The barricade failed minutes later, when the bitten man collapsed and rose again, in a frenzy of snapping teeth and tearing hands, forcing Weiss to flee as the room filled with blood and the wet sounds of violence, his faith and rational thought shattering with every step as he realized there would be no pockets of safety left. No last stand worth fighting for, only delay. Back in the storage room, Daniel discovered a maintenance hatch leading to an old waste disposal corridor that connected to the central incineration level, a place rumored to be sealed off after early test subjects had to be destroyed in bulk. And though the idea filled them both with dread, staying meant certain death. So they crawled through the hatch, dragging themselves through filth and darkness, Margaret silently crying as her sleeve brushed against something soft and unmistakably human beneath the grime, while above them the infected pounded on the door with growing coordination, stopping suddenly when the sounds below faded, as if listening. Learning. Eleanor finally completed her data transfer just as emergency power began to fail, plunging half the control hub into darkness, red lights flickering like dying embers. And in that moment she received a fragmented transmission from Daniel, his voice hoarse, but determined, telling her they were heading toward the incineration level. And she felt a surge of protectiveness mixed with guilt, because she knew that area was one of the most dangerous places in the facility, saturated with viral residue and filled with narrow choke points perfect for ambush. Yet she guided them anyway, mapping a route through her memory and warning them when to stop, when to move, when to hold their breath as infected shuffled past mere meters away. The incineration level itself was a nightmare frozen in time. Massive furnaces looming like open mouths, ash coating the floor in thick layers that muffled footsteps, but carried the unmistakable footprints of dozens of infected who had passed through earlier. And as Daniel and Margaret crept forward, they saw bodies half-burned and crawling, limbs charred yet still moving, jaws snapping even as fire-blackened fingers clawed at the ground, proving that even flames did not always bring release. And Margaret nearly broke when she recognized one of the faces, a woman from her data team whose smile she remembered from the cafeteria just days earlier, now twisted into a permanent snarl as the thing lunged and Daniel was forced to smash its skull with a heavy tool, the impact echoing through the chamber like a bell. That sound triggered movement everywhere, silhouettes emerging from behind furnaces and conveyor belts, and the couple fled again, hearts pounding as Eleanor's voice urged them toward a secondary control booth that might still be sealed. Part 5. The darkness after the total power failure changed everything, because without the constant hum of machines and lights, Site R-12 felt less like a facility and more like a vast underground tomb, where every sound carried too far and every breath seemed too loud. And Daniel and Margaret moved slowly now, no longer running, guided only by Eleanor's whispered instructions and the faint red pulse of emergency strobes that flickered like dying hearts, while ash drifted through the air of the incineration level and mixed with the metallic stench of blood, coating their tongues with every inhale and behind them the infected no longer chased blindly but followed at a distance, stopping when the couple stopped, advancing only when they moved, as if testing their reactions, confirming Eleanor's worst fear that the hive behavior was strengthening. Weiss descended the stairwell toward the incineration level just as the first of them reached him, a former security guard whose helmet hung crookedly and whose jaw worked endlessly as if chewing something invisible. And Weiss fired instinctively, the gunshot exploding through the darkness and drawing answering moans from every direction, forcing him into a brutal retreat where each bullet bought only seconds, not safety. And as he ran, he passed bodies slumped against walls, some still twitching, others unmistakably dead. The faces of colleagues frozen in expressions of disbelief that mirrored his own internal collapse. Daniel and Margaret reached the secondary control booth Eleanor had described. Its reinforced glass, cracked but intact. The door sealed by a manual wheel that resisted at first, then finally gave way with a shriek of metal. And inside they collapsed against the wall, shaking, counting their breaths, clinging to each other as if letting go would cause the world to vanish. While Eleanor monitored their position from the failing control hub, her voice cracking as she told them they were safe for the moment, though she knew safety no longer truly existed anywhere in the lab. It was there, in the cramped booth lit only by a single emergency lamp, that Margaret finally confessed she had been bitten earlier in the tunnels. A shallow wound on her calf hidden beneath torn fabric, and Daniel's world narrowed to that one revelation, his hands trembling as he inspected the bite, seeing the faint discoloration spreading outward like a bruise blooming too fast. And Eleanor heard the silence that followed over the radio and understood immediately, her chest tightening as she remembered every timeline, every failed attempt to slow infection, knowing there was no cure, no reversal. Insisting they could isolate, restrain, do something. Anything, even as Margaret begged him not to waste their last moments fighting reality. Elsewhere in the facility, small pockets of survivors made similar discoveries too late, turning on each other in panic, some choosing suicide over infection, others locking bitten friends behind doors and running as the screams began. And the infected responded to this chaos with chilling efficiency, cutting off routes, blocking stairwells with forcing survivors into dead ends, where the only options were to fight until exhaustion or surrender to teeth and hands. And through it all, the virus continued to adapt, using sound, light, and even the heat of living bodies to guide its movements. Weiss finally reached the incineration-level control room overlooking the furnaces, just as a group of infected poured in from the opposite side. And with nowhere left to retreat, he did something unthinkable, overriding safety protocols to ignite one of the furnaces at full output, drawing the infected toward the light and heat like moths, their bodies catching fire as they crossed the threshold. Yet, even as they burned, some continued forward, collapsing only when their limbs failed entirely. And Weiss watched in horror and grim fascination, realizing that destruction was the only language 55-7 truly understood. But that destruction always came at a cost, because the flames also consumed vital systems, sending shockwaves through already failing structures. Back in the control booth, Margaret's condition worsened rapidly, her skin cooling, her pulse slowing, and she smiled weakly at Daniel, telling him she was no longer afraid, that the scariest part had been imagining dying alone, and that whatever came next, she wanted him to remember her as she was now, not as what the virus would turn her into. And Daniel broke then, sobbing silently as he held her, promising he would not leave her, not ever, while Eleanor listened helplessly, tears blurring her vision as alarms flared across her panels, indicating structural instability in multiple sectors, meaning the facility itself was beginning to fail. Outside the sealed blast doors on the surface, though none of them could see it, military surveillance had detected abnormal thermal movement beneath the desert floor, signatures too numerous and too coordinated to ignore. One truth was becoming impossible to deny. And deep underground, as Margaret's breathing grew shallow and the infected gathered beyond the glass, but about choosing how the story would end, even if the world would never be allowed to know it. Part 6. Time lost its meaning inside R-12. As Margaret Ace's breaths grew slower and more uneven, each one sounding like it might be her last, and Daniel held her tighter inside the control booth, whispering memories of ordinary days, of coffee breaks and shared jokes in the data wing, trying desperately to anchor her to the person she was before LV7, while Eleanor stayed on the open channel, despite knowing there was nothing more she could do, because cutting the line felt like abandoning them. And with every second she heard the faint scraping sounds outside the booth grow more deliberate, no longer random impacts, but measured taps and drags as infected bodies positioned themselves around the glass, testing its strength, learning where to strike. Margaret finally went still, her eyes half open, her body cold in Daniel's arms, and for a long moment there was only silence broken by Daniel's shaking breath, until Eleanor softly told him what would happen next. Not as a scientist, but as someone who cared, explaining that reanimation could occur anywhere from 3 to 15 minutes after cardiac death. And Daniel nodded, even though she couldn't see him, gently laying Margaret down and using the last of the restraints in the booth to secure her wrists and ankles, tears streaming down his face as he kissed her forehead and whispered goodbye again and again. Elsewhere, Weiss moved through smoke-filled corridors as the fire he had unleashed spread beyond the incineration chamber. Sprinklers long dead, alarms useless, and the infected responding not with fear but with furious attraction to the heat, converging in waves that forced him to retreat deeper into maintenance areas, his ammunition nearly gone, his body exhausted, yet his mind strangely clear, accepting that redemption would not come from survival, but from delay, from buying minutes for others, even if it cost him everything. Eleanor, scanning what few sensors still functioned, saw movement patterns shifting, infected abandoning random sectors and flowing towards central shafts and stairwells, clustering as if drawn by an unseen signal. And she understood with horror that 55-7 had reached another threshold, that the hive was no longer just reactive but directive, capable of concentrating force, meaning that any remaining safe rooms would soon be overwhelmed. And she transmitted this assessment to Washington, knowing it might be the last coherent data they would ever receive. Inside the booth, Daniel watched the clock with unbearable focus as the minutes passed, every muscle tensing as he waited for the inevitable. And when Margaret's body finally convulsed, restraints snapping tight as her back arched and a low growl escaped her throat, Daniel screamed and backed away, pressing himself into the corner as the thing that rose was no longer the woman he loved. Her eyes clouded and unfocused, her jaw working violently as she strained against the bindings, teeth snapping inches from his face, and through his sobs he understood the cruelest truth of LV7, that it did not merely kill, it desecrated memory, using familiar faces as weapons. Eleanor stayed with him through it, her voice breaking as she told him he was not alone, that what he felt mattered, even if history would erase them. And Daniel, gathering what little strength he had left, asked her to promise something in return, that she would not let the truth die, that whatever happened, the world would one day know what Sight or One-Two had become. And Eleanor swore it, even as she knew the decision had likely already been taken far above them. The control booth glass finally began to crack under repeated impacts from outside as more infected arrived, their bodies slamming in coordinated bursts, and Daniel realized there would be no quiet ending, no gentle fade into darkness, only choice. And with shaking hands, he reached for a heavy steel tool left on the floor, his eyes never leaving Margaret's restrained form, while far above, military commanders stared at incoming reports showing unprecedented underground heat buildup and movement density, the final confirmation that containment had failed completely. And as emergency authorization codes began to circulate, Site R-12 echoed with a low, distant rumble. Not yet an explosion, but a warning, as if the Earth itself was bracing for what was about to be done to erase a nightmare that had grown too large to bury any other way. Part 7. The distant rumble grew stronger, vibrating through the concrete and steel like a slow, angry heartbeat. And although Daniel did not yet know what it meant, he felt instinctively that time itself was collapsing around him, because the control booth glass finally shattered inward, under a coordinated surge of infected bodies, shards spraying across the floor as hands and faces pressed through the opening, jaws snapping blindly. And in that moment, Daniel made the hardest decision of his life, swinging the heavy steel tool with all the strength grief had left him, striking Margaret's skull just once, then again, until the movement stopped, until the thing wherein her face finally went still, and the silence that followed was louder than any scream, because it marked the end of the last piece of his former world. He did not cry after that, Something inside him emptied out completely, leaving only resolve, and as the infected flooded the booth, he slipped past them through a service hatch Eleanor had forgotten even existed, sealing it behind him just as claws raked across the metal, while Eleanor listened in horror and heartbreak, realizing what he had done without needing words. And she told him softly that she was proud of him, not as a scientist or a supervisor, but as a human being who had loved fiercely to the very end. Weiss, meanwhile, reached the lowest maintenance level near the central shaft, coughing from smoke and chemical fumes, where he discovered dozens of infected gathered in near-perfect stillness, standing shoulder to shoulder around a ventilation column, their heads tilted as if listening to something only they could hear. And this sight terrified him more than any attack, because he confirmed that LV-7 was now coordinating on a level that resembled intent, possibly even anticipation. And when one of them slowly turned its head toward him and the rest followed in unison, Weiss knew the lab had crossed into something no longer accidental. Daniel emerged into a narrow conduit running parallel to the central shaft, heat radiating through the walls, emergency lights dead, guided only by Eleanor's voice and his own stubborn will, stepping over bodies and fragments that told the story of people who had tried and failed to run before him. And as he moved, he began to hear it too, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to agitate the infected, causing them to pause, cluster, then move again with renewed urgency, as if the entire hive sensed a coming change. Eleanor, monitoring the last surviving instruments, realized that the Surface Command had initiated a full-spectrum escalation protocol. Not yet the final strike, but the irreversible steps leading toward it, including airspace clearance and weapons arming. And though she had expected this moment, its reality hit her with crushing force, because it meant that no rescue was coming, only erasure. And she tried to warn Daniel not to seek the surface, knowing the blast doors would never open again. But Daniel replied calmly that he wasn't trying to escape anymore, that he just didn't want to die alone in the dark. And those words haunted her as the infected began flooding the conduit from both ends, forcing him into a sprint despite his exhaustion. Weiss made his last stand near the shaft controls, triggering emergency venting that released superheated air and chemical suppressant in violent bursts, shredding infected bodies and buying precious minutes. And as they tore into him at last, dragging him down under clawing hands and snapping teeth, his final thought was not regret, but grim clarity, that Project Lazarus had succeeded in one way at least. It had proven that some weapons were so absolute they could only ever be used once. Deep underground, the hive surged towards central structures as if compelled by instinct, filling shafts and chambers with writhing bodies, while Eleanor recorded one last message, her voice steady despite the tears on her face, documenting the behavior patterns. The airborne transmission, the emotional cost, naming Daniel and Margaret so they would not vanish into anonymity. And as she finished, the rumble intensified into a constant roar, dust falling from ceilings, cracks racing along walls, and for the first time since the outbreak began, even the infected seemed unsettled, their movements growing erratic as if they sensed something vast and final approaching. Because above the desert, unseen and unharmed by those below, the machinery of annihilation was fully awake, and the countdown toward a decision that would erase Site R-12 from existence had quietly, irrevocably begun. Part 8. The roaring vibration became a constant presence, no longer just a sound, but a pressure that pressed against the skull and made the walls of Site R-12 shed dust and fragments like a dying body. And Daniel felt it through the soles of his feet as he staggered through the conduit, the infected around him behaving strangely now, some pausing mid- emergency lights flickering weakly over shattered monitors. Noting that Elebe? -7 appeared to react to extreme seismic activity with disorientation, suggesting its coordination relied on subtle environmental feedback that could be overwhelmed. A discovery that would never be published, never debated, never credited. Daniel eventually reached a collapsed junction where the conduit opened into a massive maintenance cavern, its ceiling cracked and sagging, and there he found a small cluster of survivors huddled together. Engineers and technicians who had barricaded themselves with overturned equipment, their faces hollow and streaked with soot. and for a brief moment, seeing another living human broke through the numbness that had taken hold of him. But that moment shattered when one of them recognized the bite mark on his arm, fresh from an earlier struggle, and fear spread through the group faster than the virus itself. Weapons raised, voices shaking as they demanded he stay back, and Daniel understood without anger that they were already lost, not to infection but to terror. And he turned away before they could decide to do something irreversible. The infected began pouring into the cavern soon after, drawn by sound and movement, and the survivors' barricade became a trap as screams echoed and gunfire flared uselessly. Daniel fleeing once more as the hive adapted, splitting its approach, cutting off exits, herding prey with chilling precision. And he realized then that LV-7 was no longer just reacting to humans, it was shaping their behavior, turning fear into a tool. Eleanor watched sensor after sensor go dark as underground shock readings spiked dramatically, confirming that surface preparations had moved beyond theory into execution. And she received one final coded transmission from command acknowledging receipt of her data and ordering immediate evacuation of all remaining airborne assets from the region. A message that did not mention rescue, did not mention survivors, only containment. And she whispered goodbye to a world that would never hear her story before transmitting her last log and destroying the remaining archives to prevent partial, dangerous leaks. Daniel climbed toward a sealed observation chamber overlooking the central shaft, his body failing him, infection creeping upward as his vision blurred and his muscles spasmed. Yet he forced himself onward, driven by a need to see something real at the end. And when he reached the chamber, he saw the hive below him in its full, horrifying scale. Hundreds of infected bodies packed together in organized clusters, moving in waves that pulsed with the vibration of the approaching strike, a grotesque parody of unity. And as he collapsed against the glass, he laughed softly through tears, realizing that the weapon meant to terrify nations had instead built its own army underground, one that would never march, because it would never be allowed to exist. Elena felt the same vibration through the floor as structural integrity warnings flared one final time, and she sat down in the center of the control hub, closing her eyes as she thought of Daniel and Margaret, of Weiss, of everyone whose names would be erased. And in her last conscious act, she activated the facility-wide data purge and sealed the remaining internal doors. But to ensure that nothing escaped upward through fractured tunnels when the Earth finally opened, and as the countdown on a surface clock ticked closer to zero, knowing he had reached the end of the road, even as the story itself was not yet finished. And the sky was about to answer with fire. Part 9. The pressure inside Site R-12 reached an almost unbearable intensity as hairline fractures spread across ceilings and walls, concrete dust falling like gray snow while the underground structure groaned under stresses it was never designed to withstand. And Daniel remained slumped against the observation chamber glass, his breathing shallow and uneven as the infection advanced, veins darkening beneath his skin, his thoughts drifting in fragments between memories of Margaret's laughter and the terrible, synchronized movement of the hive below, where hundreds of infected bodies shifted restlessly, no longer advancing or retreating but swaying in tight formations, as if awaiting a signal. And it terrified him that even now, at the very edge of annihilation, they seemed to sense that something decisive was coming. Across the facility, the last remaining survivors were being erased and scattered. Silent moments, small pockets of resistance collapsing without screams, as fear finally robbed them of the energy to fight, while others chose to end their lives on their own terms rather than feel their minds slip away. And in every corridor the same grim pattern repeated, death followed by motion, bodies rising again, only to be crushed under falling debris or torn apart by the weight of collapsing infrastructure, turning the lab into a churning mass of ruin and flesh. Eleanor, alone in the control hub, felt the building shudder violently and knew that even without external intervention the facility would not hold much longer. Yet she also understood that a partial collapse would be the worst possible outcome, because fractured tunnels and breached rock could give the virus pathways toward the surface. And with shaking hands she reviewed the last predictive models, seeing confirmation of what Command already feared, that if Site R-12 were merely abandoned or allowed to cave in naturally. LV-7 would not stay buried, and that realization hardened her resolve even as it broke her heart. Daniel, fighting through waves of dizziness, managed to activate the chamber's internal recorder. Not for data or science, but for something simpler, speaking haltingly about who they had been, about Margaret and the others, about how none of them had set out to end the world. And as his words echoed faintly in the empty room, he felt a strange calm, accepting that his role was not to survive, but to witness, to exist long enough for the truth to be spoken even if no one ever listened. The hive below grew increasingly agitated as vibrations intensified, infected turning their faces upward in unison. Jaws opening and closing as a low, almost vocal resonance filled the shaft. Not a scream, but a collective response to the changing environment. And for the first time, Daniel wondered whether LV-7 had begun to experience something like anticipation. A final, primitive awareness that its brief dominion was ending. Deep within the remaining structural supports, emergency failsafes triggered one by one, sealing off fractured sectors and funneling what movement remained toward the central mass, unintentionally concentrating the infected even further. While on the surface above the desert, unseen preparations reached their final stages. Airspace cleared, command lines locked, and decisions signed that would never be publicly acknowledged. And though Eleanor could no longer receive live communications, she felt the inevitability of what was coming as clearly as if she could see it, a cold certainty settling over her like a shroud. Dano's vision dimmed as the infection finally reached his brain, the world narrowing to the slow pulse of light and shadow beyond the glass. And in his last coherent moment, he imagined Margaret standing beside him, not as the monster she had become, but as the woman she was. Her hand, warm in his hand, a cider, -12, trembled violently around him. He closed his eyes and waited, while the hive below surged once more, filling the shaft completely, unknowingly gathering itself into a single, doomed heart. Because the next chapter of this buried nightmare would not be written by teeth or claws or fear, but by a force far greater, descending from the sky, with the sole purpose of ensuring that nothing living, dead, or reborn would ever crawl out of this place again. Part 10. The final moments of Site R-12 began, not with a single explosion, but with a silence so absolute that even the hive seemed to feel it. A brief pause in vibration, movement, and sound as if the world itself had inhaled, and far above the Nevada desert, beyond the reach of anything buried underground, American military command executed an order that would never exist on paper. As bombers and missile platforms already positioned days earlier received synchronized launch authorization, the decision justified as a containment necessity, classified under layers of secrecy so deep that even many of those who signed it would later convince themselves it had been a natural disaster. And as the first missile broke through the upper atmosphere, its heat signature invisible to those below, Eleanor opened her eyes one last time in the darkened control hub, feeling the ground beneath her vibrate with a new frequency. Different from structural collapse or fire, something vast and descending. And she whispered Daniel and Margaret's names like a prayer, knowing this was the only ending that ensured no piece of LV-7 would ever reach the surface. Deep in the central shaft, the hive reacted violently as the pressure wave reached the bedrock. Infected bodies screaming without voices, jaws snapping as the organized mass finally broke into chaos. Too late to adapt, too late to learn. As the first impact hit, a kinetic strike designed to penetrate deep into the earth before detonating, turning layers of rock, steel, and concrete into vapor in an instant. And Daniel, slumped against the observation glass, felt only a sudden warmth and a blinding white light as the chamber ceased to exist. His body and the infection inside him erased so completely that nothing remained to rise again. No pain, no fear, just an end. The second and third missiles followed within seconds, targeted precisely at fault points mapped from Eleanor's final data. Collapsing tunnels, ceiling shafts, crushing every remaining pocket of movement under unimaginable force. And the underground hive, once terrifying in its coordination, was reduced to fragments of ash and pressure-scorched bone. LV-7's cellular structure torn apart at a molecular level by heat and shock far beyond its capacity to adapt, proving at last that while the virus had conquered fear and death, it could not conquer annihilation. From the surface, the desert floor bulged and cracked before imploding inward, sand and rock collapsing into a massive crater as a shockwave rippled outward. flattening monitoring equipment and forcing aircraft to pull back. And within minutes, Site R-12 was gone. Not ruined, not buried, but erased. Its existence reduced to seismic readings and classified after-action reports stamped top secret and locked away, while official statements would later describe the event as a failed underground weapons test, an accident, a footnote. In Cold War history, in the days that followed, specialized teams surveyed the crater from a distance, confirming radiation-free readings, no biological signatures, no movement, nothing alive or reanimated remaining. And with clinical efficiency, the area was declared permanently restricted. Its coordinates removed from public records, its name never spoken again outside secured rooms. While Eleanor's final transmission was dissected, archived, and ultimately sealed, its human cost deemed unnecessary for future generations to know. Years passed, then decades, and Project Lazarus was quietly referenced only as a cautionary line in classified training manuals. Stripped of faces, names, and screams, yet somewhere in a locked archive, Eleanor's last log remained intact, listing Daniel and Margaret Cole, not as casualties, but as witnesses, proof that love and humanity had survived, even inside a nightmare engineered to erase both. And though the world moved on unaware, the truth lingered beneath layers of secrecy. That in 1955, America did not just destroy a laboratory. It destroyed a mistake so profound that it chose fire from the sky over the risk of memory. An eben na, when satellites pass over that silent crater and instruments detect nothing but empty rock, there are those who still believe the ground remembers. Because some horrors are not meant to be studied, only buried so deeply that history itself pretends they never happened.